The first thing I learned about desperation is that it changes your voice. It makes it softer when you ask for help, and louder when you realize none is coming. After the doctor's news, the days began to blend together. Work, bills, hospital visits, and long nights counting coins that used to mean nothing. I told myself I could manage it alone. I'd always been the one who found a way. But there's a point when even pride starts to taste like dust. So I called my family. Diane was the first to answer. She always did. She liked being the responsible sister, the one with answers, plans, and picture-perfect Christmas cards. "Clara," she said, her voice already tired. "You sound exhausted. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied. "I just need to ask a favor." There was a pause. That small silence where you can feel someone preparing to say no before you've even finished your sentence. "Go on," she said finally. "I've started selling what I can. But Evan's surgery, it's going to take more than I can raise in time." "I wouldn't ask if—" "Oh, honey," she interrupted softly. "You shouldn't do that to yourself. There must be assistance programs. Didn't you say the hospital has something for single mothers?" "I've tried them all. The lists are endless. What about Luke?" The mention of his name was a knife turned slowly. "He's not part of this anymore." "But he's the father, Clara. He should help." I could hear the sharpness in her tone. Not anger, just the kind of logic that sounds cruel when you've never been the one left behind. "He sends cards for birthdays," I said flatly. "That's all." There was another pause. I could hear dishes clinking in the background, her life moving on while mine stalled. "I just don't want you to do anything reckless. I'll talk to Mark. Maybe we can lend you something, but we're stretched thin with the wedding." Her voice trailed off, wrapped in guilt that felt too polite to be real. "I understand," I said. "Don't worry about it. We'll pray," she added quickly, as if faith could fill the space that money couldn't. When the call ended, I sat for a while in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. "We'll pray," that was her offering. "I suppose it's easier to hand someone heaven than your credit card." I tried Caleb next. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough from years of construction work. "Hey, little sister. How's the shop?" I laughed as a small broken sound. "It's surviving, barely. Listen, Caleb, I wouldn't call if it weren't important." He listened quietly as I explained everything. The doctor's news, the cost, my plan to sell everything I owned. "Jesus, Clara," he muttered. That's a lot, I know. I'm not asking for much. Just anything helps," he sighed. "You know we just bought that new truck, and we're still paying off the roof repairs. Times are tight." I could hear his wife in the background asking who was on the phone. He muted himself for a moment, and when he came back, his tone had softened. "Look, I'll see what I can do. Maybe a few hundred, but don't expect miracles." I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Thank you. I mean it." "You're a good mom, Clara," he said, voice heavy. "But sometimes you've got to accept what is. You can't save the world." "I'm not trying to save the world," I whispered. "Just one little boy in it." He didn't answer that. By the end of that week, I'd heard every variation of "I wish I could help" there was. From family. From friends. From old customers who patted my hand and told me I was strong. Strength, I learned, is often a word people use when they don't want to get involved. The worst came from my mother. Ruth called on Friday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen counter, sorting through a pile of envelopes, bills, receipts, and a photo Evan had drawn of us holding hands under a rainbow. "Clara," she began, her voice soft but distant. "Diane told me what's going on. You should have come to me first. I didn't want to worry you." "You worry me by hiding things," she said. You know I'd do anything for you. A flicker of hope sparked inside me. Then maybe, but, she interrupted, I can't fund something that might not work, darling. You understand that, don't you? You have to be realistic. Realistic. The word scraped against my chest like sandpaper. He's 6 years old, Mom. I know, she said quietly. And if it's meant to be, it will be. God doesn't make mistakes. I wanted to ask her if she'd say the same thing if it were Diane's child, if faith would still feel like surrender then. But I bit my tongue. I'll pray for him, she said. And for you. You're carrying too much alone. That's the thing about carrying, I murmured. No one else can do it for you. When the call ended, I cried for the first time in months. The kind of cry that leaves you hollow, as though even your tears are leaving you behind. The excuses came wrapped in sympathy. We're just not in a position right now. You know I love you, but it's complicated. It's God's will. Each word was a polite refusal disguised as comfort. I learned to stop asking. Instead, I worked longer hours. I took on funeral arrangements, late-night deliveries, Valentine's orders that left my hands raw from thorns and ribbons. I even offered to rent out part of my shop for local events. Anything to keep the lights on, to inch closer to that impossible goal. Some nights I fell asleep on the shop's back couch, too tired to climb the stairs. The air smelled of fertilizer and fading lilies. I'd wake to the sound of rain against the windows, Everford's steady, sorrowful rhythm, and wonder if Evan would still be breathing a year from now. One evening, Diane stopped by unexpectedly. She arrived just before closing, her perfume heavy and floral, her car gleaming like it had never known dust. "You're still here?" she asked, stepping inside. "It's so dark in here, Clara." "I like it that way," I said. She looked around, her eyes scanning the empty shelves. "You sold the delivery van?" "Had to," she frowned. "You're taking this too far." "Too far?" I laughed softly. "There's no such thing when it's your child." She hesitated, then reached into her purse and handed me an envelope. I stared at it. "It's not much," she said. "Just a few hundred. Maybe it'll help." I wanted to thank her. I really did. But something in her tone, the way she said not much like it was a mercy, made it impossible. "Thank you," I said finally. "It'll go toward his medication." "You should come to the wedding," she said quickly, as if to change the subject. "Lillian keeps asking about you." I almost laughed again. "Your daughter's wedding isn't exactly where I belong right now." "It might do you good to get out, Clara." She meant well, I think. But the words sounded like they came from another world, a place untouched by hospital walls and medical bills. "I'll think about it," I said, though we both knew I wouldn't. When she left, the bell above the door jingled softly, and I felt the silence close in behind her. That night, I found Evan sitting up in bed, pale and sweating, clutching his chest. "Mom," he whispered, "it hurts again." Panic clawed at my throat. I called the hospital and they told me to bring him in. The drive through the rain felt endless, the windshield wipers beating time to my heartbeat. I carried him inside, his small body trembling against my shoulder. Hours passed under harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Hayes came out at dawn, his face drawn but calm. "He's stable for now," he said. "But Clara, we're running out of time." I nodded, tears slipping silently down my face. "I'll find the money," I whispered. "I'll find it." He looked at me like he wanted to believe that too. When we returned home, the morning light had turned the rain into fog. Evan fell asleep on the couch, his small hand curled around mine. I looked around our bare apartment. the walls stripped of paintings, the shelves empty. What was left to sell? Maybe the shop itself. Maybe everything. I realized then that my family wasn't heartless. They were comfortable. And comfort breeds excuses. They didn't mean harm. They simply didn't understand what it meant to live at the edge of loss every single day. They spoke of God, logic and responsibility, all while I spoke the language of love, raw and wordless. And somewhere between their excuses and my exhaustion, I began to understand something painful and pure. The people who love you most can still fail you completely. My name is Clara Jennings. I'm 36 years old, and I own a small flower shop called Wild Petals on Main Street in Everford, Tennessee. A quiet town stitched between misty hills and tired highways. Most days smell like rain-soaked asphalt and honeysuckle, and the mornings come slow, as if the world is always just waking up from a heavy dream. I used to think flowers could fix anything, that beauty, no matter how fleeting, could heal pain. But that belief began to crumble the morning I sat across from Dr. Hayes in the cold light of Everford Memorial Hospital. His office window overlooked the parking lot, and outside, the world went on like nothing was breaking. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle but unyielding, "Evan's heart isn't recovering the way we hoped. The next step is surgery. And soon." My breath caught. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "Surgery? You said the medication was working." He sighed. That practiced, rehearsed sound that doctors use when they've had to deliver too much bad news in one lifetime. It was, but the progression has accelerated. We can't wait much longer. His words fell heavy and final, like the closing of a door. I walked out of that hospital with a stack of papers in my hand, estimates, timelines, risks. But the only thing I could focus on was the number at the bottom of the page. The cost of saving my son's life was more than everything I owned. That night, I sat on the floor of our apartment above the shop, the air thick with the scent of wilting lilacs. My son, Evan, 6 years old, lay asleep in the next room, small, pale, his breathing uneven like waves that forget how to reach the shore. He had his father's dark hair, but not his father's strength to stay. Luke left when Evan was 2. He said the hospital rooms, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, it all made him feel trapped. He wanted a normal life, and somehow we no longer fit into his version of normal. He moved to Atlanta, started another family, and sent birthday cards without return addresses. So it was just me and Evan now. Always had been. I looked at the bills again that night, at the cruel arithmetic of love and survival, and whispered, to the ceiling, "I'll sell everything I own if it keeps you alive." And I meant it. The next morning, I started with the things that hurt least. My grandmother's china, a few antique vases I used for wedding arrangements. Then the furniture, the oak dining table where Evan used to color outside the lines, the velvet chair I inherited from my mother. Every sale felt like tearing pages from a book I wasn't ready to finish. But every dollar felt like one step closer to keeping my boy breathing. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd rebuild, reopen, replant everything I'd torn apart once Evan was safe. But life doesn't give you guarantees, only choices that cost too much. When I told my family, I thought they'd understand. My older sister, Diane, lived across town in a large house with white columns and a manicured lawn. She'd married well, a man who sold insurance and liked to talk about golf and God in the same breath. My brother Caleb was a contractor, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of man who measured life in square footage and efficiency. And then there was Ruth, my mother, who still wore pearls even when she watered her plants. We met at Diane's house that Sunday. Her living room smelled like cinnamon and privilege. "Clara," Diane said, stirring sugar into her coffee like she was rehearsing patience. "You can't just start selling everything you own. There are programs, charities." "I've checked," I said. "There's a waiting list, months long." "Then wait," she replied. "You can't bankrupt yourself." "What happens if—" She stopped. She couldn't say the word if he doesn't make it. Caleb leaned forward, hands clasped. "You need to think about yourself too, Clara. You're young. You can't throw away your future for something uncertain." I looked at him, my brother who once scraped his knees protecting me from a playground bully, and wondered when love learned to make calculations. "He's my son," I said softly. "My future doesn't exist without him." No one replied. My mother sighed, setting her teacup down like it was heavier than her heart. "Some things are meant to be, darling," she murmured. "God has his plans. Don't fight them too hard." I wanted to scream, to tell her that faith wasn't meant to be passive, that love was the most active thing in the world. But I just nodded, because arguing with people who sleep soundly at night feels pointless when you haven't slept in weeks. A few days later, Diane called. "You're still coming to the wedding, right?" she asked. Her daughter, Lillian, was getting married in March. I had done the floral arrangements, pale pink peonies, white roses, imported orchids that cost more than a month's rent. I'd poured everything into those flowers because they were my escape, my art, my only steady thing. But now, even beauty felt like betrayal. "I don't know if I can," I said. "Evan's condition—" "Oh, Clara," she interrupted. "It would mean so much if you came. We'll cover your ticket." I didn't have the heart to tell her that my world was falling apart, while hers was being decorated with flowers worth more than my son's life. That night, I sat by Evan's bed, watching the way his small chest rose and fell beneath the lamplight. His room smelled like antiseptic, and the faint sweetness of the vanilla candle I kept burning to hide the scent of medicine. He opened his eyes, drowsy but smiling. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." "Why do you look sad?" I brushed his hair back from his forehead. "I'm not sad, just thinking." "About flowers?" I smiled weakly. "Something like that." He nodded, satisfied, and drifted back to sleep. I turned away before the tears came. In that silence, I thought of every sacrifice waiting for me. The shop lease would have to go next, maybe even the apartment. The ring I'd kept tucked away in a drawer, the only thing Luke had left behind, could fetch a few $1,000s if I was lucky. Every object around me began to shimmer with price tags instead of memories. The next morning, I unlocked Wild Petals early. The bell above the door jingled like a memory of happier days. The shop was my sanctuary. Walls painted sage green, shelves lined with glass jars and sun-dappled leaves. The air was cool and fragrant with fresh blooms. Tulips, lilies, baby's breath. A young couple walked in hand, eyes bright with love. They wanted a bouquet, something simple but meaningful for their anniversary. As I wrapped their flowers in brown paper, the girl said, "You must love your job, being surrounded by beauty every day." I smiled, but it trembled. "Yes," I said quietly. "Beauty keeps me from falling apart." They left with their bouquet, and I stood there, alone, Surrounded by color, I could no longer afford to see. The rain began again, slow and steady, tapping against the windows like an old friend reminding me of everything I had to lose. I thought of my son's smile, of the warmth of his small hand in mine, and I knew I would sell every petal, every dream, every last thing I had. Because love, real love, doesn't stop at the edge of reason. It keeps going, even when you've run out of everything else. When the invitation arrived, I almost threw it away. It was tucked neatly inside a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Lillian Harper and Thomas Bell. My niece. Diane's only daughter. The ceremony would be at the Everford Lakeside Pavilion, one of the most expensive venues in the county. The kind of place where everything shimmered. The glass, the lake, even the guests. I stared at the gold print, my fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't anger I felt, not exactly. It was something quieter. A hollow ache where envy and grief mixed until you couldn't tell which was which. I hadn't planned to go. But that week, Evan's doctor told me something that left me no choice but to face them. We need to schedule the surgery soon, Dr. Hayes said. Within weeks, not months. His words hung in the air like fog that wouldn't lift. I still don't have enough, I whispered. Then find help, he said softly. Whatever you have to do. So I did. I swallowed my pride. I told myself I'd go to the wedding, stand among the laughter and music, and find the courage to ask my family again, this time face to face. Maybe, I thought, if they saw how desperate I was, they'd finally understand. The morning of the wedding, I opened the closet and stared at what was left. My best dress, a faded navy one I'd worn to a funeral 2 years ago, still smelled faintly of lilies. I ironed it carefully, patched a loose hem, and tied my hair into a bun. Evan was with a neighbor, Mrs. Grant, who'd promised to watch him for the afternoon. He'd smiled weakly when I left. You look pretty, Mommy, he said. Thank you, sweetheart. I'll bring you something nice, okay? Cake? If there's cake, it's yours. He grinned, and for a moment, I almost believed everything would be fine. When I arrived at the pavilion, I almost turned back. The parking lot was filled with sleek cars, people in suits and silk gowns, the scent of roses and champagne floating in the air. The decorations, thousands of imported white orchids, cascaded down the archway like clouds, orchids. My sister had once complained they were too expensive for everyday arrangements. And yet here they were, everywhere, delicate, flawless, alive. The irony burned my throat. Inside, I found Diane surrounded by guests, radiant in a soft lavender dress. When she saw me, her eyes widened in surprise. Clara, you came? Of course, I said softly. Wouldn't miss it. She hugged me, careful not to wrinkle her dress. How's Evan? He's resting. The doctors say it needs to happen soon. Her smile faltered slightly. I've been thinking about that. I wish I could do more. I was hoping we could talk later, I said, voice trembling despite myself. Maybe after the ceremony, she nodded, her expression unreadable. Of course. The ceremony itself was beautiful, painfully so. The kind of beauty that stings because it reminds you of everything you've lost. Lillian looked like she'd stepped out of a painting, her white gown glistening under the soft sunlight filtering through the windows. The guests cried when she said her vows. I didn't. My tears had other places to go. During the reception, I stood near the back, clutching a glass of water while waiters carried trays of champagne. The room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, the sound of abundance. I found Diane near the dessert table. She was talking to a group of women about the orchids. "They were imported from Singapore," she said proudly. "Worth every penny," the women gasped. I did the math in my head. The flowers alone could have paid for Evan's surgery deposit. And then some. When the crowd thinned, I approached her. "Can we talk now?" I asked. She glanced around, uneasy. "Here?" "Please." We stepped out to the patio overlooking the lake. The air was cool, the water rippling under soft wind. "I hate to ask again," I began, "but I'm running out of time." "The surgery?" She turned toward me, eyes glassy with sympathy. "Clara, please don't do this today." "Do what?" "Bring this here. It's Lillian's wedding." "You said we'd talk." "We are talking," she said quickly, "but not about that. You can't keep making everything about your problems. You're not the only one who's struggling." I stared at her, stunned. "Struggling?" I whispered. "You spent more on flowers today than I need to keep my son alive." Her face hardened. "That's not fair." "Fair?" I laughed bitterly. "Nothing about this is fair." She took a breath, straightened her shoulders. Always the calm one, the composed one. "Clara, I love you, I do. But you can't keep expecting everyone to fix this for you. Sometimes we have to accept what's beyond our control." Her words cut deeper than any refusal could. "I'm not asking you to fix it," I said, voice trembling. "I'm asking you to care." But she was already looking away, back toward the glowing lights and music, toward her daughter's laughter. "Please enjoy yourself," she said softly. "Evan wouldn't want you to be sad." And with that, she walked away. I stayed on the patio long after the music grew faint. The night air carried the smell of champagne and orchids, and somewhere across the lake, fireworks began to bloom in the sky. White, gold, red. I thought about how people call fireworks beautiful, but all I could hear was the sound of money burning. When I finally left, the wedding was still in full swing. Laughter echoed through the parking lot as I walked to my car. My shoes were soaked from the wet grass, and my heart felt heavier than the night itself. As I started the engine, I whispered to the darkness, "I will never ask again." Because I finally understood. Their love had limits. Mine didn't, and from that moment on, I made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however far I had to go, I would find a way to save my son. Alone. It happened 2 weeks after the wedding. Evan's cough had grown harsher. Deep, scraping, the kind that sounds like it hurts the soul more than the lungs. The nights became longer, filled with the steady beep of his monitor and my whispered prayers into the dark. One night, he woke me with a cry. His little body was burning with fever. I rushed him to the hospital, barefoot, coat half on, rain hitting the windshield like 1,000 tiny accusations. In the ER, fluorescent lights flickered overhead as nurses moved like ghosts in scrubs. I sat in the corner, holding his shoes in my lap, waiting for the doctor's verdict. Dr. Hayes came in, face pale from too many long nights. "Clara," he said gently, "he's stable now. But this can't keep happening. We're running out of time." I nodded, though the world was blurring around the edges. "I'm doing everything I can," I whispered. He sighed, looked at me with something like pity. Sometimes love isn't enough. But it had to be. It was all I had left when I got home the next morning. The shop felt foreign, like it belonged to someone who used to dream. The counters were bare, the cooler stood empty, humming softly. I'd sold the last of my stock the week before. There was nothing left to arrange, no color left to hide behind. The landlord had called twice already about the rent. I'd stopped answering. The electricity bill sat unopened on the counter. I looked around and realized I was standing inside the shell of my old life. The next day, I closed Wild Petals for good. I didn't tell anyone. I just locked the door, slid the key under the mat, and walked away. The sound of the rain against the sign was the only goodbye. That evening, I went through my remaining things, the ones I hadn't been able to part with. My mother's old rosary, Evan's baby blanket, the photo of us at the county fair, his face covered in ice cream, his laughter caught forever in the frame. I found the velvet box buried in a drawer, my engagement ring. Gold band, small diamond, nothing extraordinary. But it had once meant everything. I stared at it for a long time, my reflection fractured in the gem. Then I slipped it into my pocket. The next morning, I walked to the pawn shop on Jefferson Street. The man behind the counter barely looked up. "How much?" I asked, placing it down gently. He examined it, eyes cold and practiced. "800, he said. I had imagined more, but I nodded. When I walked out, the sun was setting, turning the wet pavement to gold. I clutched the cash like it might vanish. That night, I counted every dollar, hospital bills, medications, and the surgery estimate. Even with the ring, I was still short by thousands. And for the first time, I felt something close to despair. Not loud or angry, but quiet, like a room running out of air. At midnight, I sat by Evan's bed. He was asleep, his hand resting on mine. I watched his chest rise and fall and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm trying." In the dark, I could hear my own heartbeat, steady, stubborn, afraid. There comes a moment in every mother's life when love demands too much and still, she gives more. That was my breaking point, not the moment I ran out of money, but the moment I realized I would give even the last piece of myself if it meant he could stay. And I would, whatever it cost. The call came on a Sunday morning. It was raining again. It always seemed to rain in Everford, and I was standing by the window, watching water trace silver lines down the glass. Evan was in his room, coloring, his tiny hand clutching a crayon with the seriousness of a man signing his name on history. Then the phone rang. "Ms. Jennings?" It was Dr. Hayes. His voice was careful, too careful. "There's been a development. A donor heart just became available, but you'll need to be ready within the hour." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, hope and fear colliding like thunder. "We'll be there," I said, already grabbing my coat, shaking as I packed Evan's bag. At the hospital, everything happened fast. Papers, signatures, nurses moving like tides around us. They prepped him for surgery while I stood beside the gurney, pretending to be calm. Evan looked up at me, eyes half-lidded from the sedatives. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Can I dream about the park?" I smiled, though my throat ached. "You can dream about anything you want." He nodded, then whispered, "Will you be here when I wake up?" I swallowed the truth, the fear, the whole trembling world inside me. "Always." They wheeled him away, the hallway stretching longer than I remembered, and I stood there, arms empty, heart breaking open in quiet silence. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time stopped making sense. I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by strangers with the same hollow eyes, the same forced patience. The walls were pale blue, the color of hope that's been diluted too many times. Every sound felt too loud. Footsteps, the tick of a clock, the shuffle of papers. I prayed, though I wasn't sure to whom anymore. Then, sometime after midnight, Dr. Hayes appeared. His face told me everything before his words did. We did everything we could. I felt the world tilt. The floor disappeared, and the sound that came from me didn't feel human. It was raw, ancient, something pulled from the core of grief itself. No, I whispered. Please, no. He placed a hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. His heart was too weak. The damage. It was too much. I don't remember leaving the hospital. I only remember the sound of rain hitting the pavement as I walked out. The same rain that had been falling when he was born. That night, I sat on his empty bed, the blanket still warm from the morning, his drawing still on the floor, a rainbow, 2 stick figures holding hands. The silence was unbearable. I picked up the drawing and pressed it to my chest, whispering his name until my voice was gone. People think loss is loud, that it comes with screaming, breaking, falling apart. But real loss is quiet. It's the stillness after the storm, when the world keeps moving and you don't. I had given everything I owned, everything I was. And yet, it wasn't enough. That was the night I said goodbye, not to his body, but to the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hand, the small, beautiful chaos of our days. The world had gone silent, and I was still here, and for the first time in my life I didn't know why. Time didn't move after Evan died. It just stretched, long, thin, endless, like fog that never lifted. The first few weeks blurred together. People came and went, carrying casseroles and condolences. They spoke softly, as if grief were contagious. I nodded, smiled when I could, and forgot most of what they said. Diane visited once. She stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of lilies, the kind I used to sell. They're beautiful, I said, though I could barely look at them. I thought they might bring comfort, she murmured. I wanted to tell her that flowers die faster when the air is heavy with sadness. But instead I just said thank you. When she left, she placed an envelope on the counter. I didn't open it. Money didn't mean anything anymore. Eventually, the world stopped waiting for me. Bills returned. The shop was gone. The apartment lease expired. I sold what little remained and moved into a small room above an old bakery near the edge of town. It smelled of sugar and yeast. And every morning, the warmth from the ovens reminded me that life went on, even when you wished it wouldn't. I got a job there, washing dishes. The owner, Mrs. Lane, never asked about my past. She just handed me an apron and said, "We all start over somehow." In that tiny kitchen, I began to remember how to breathe. The steady rhythm of scrubbing, rinsing, stacking plates, it gave shape to the hours. Some nights, when the bakery closed, I'd walk down to the lake near the old pavilion, the same place where Diane's daughter had been married. The flowers were long gone, but sometimes I still smelled them in the air. I'd sit on the same bench where I once begged for help and whisper to the water, "I kept my promise, baby. I did everything I could." And for the first time, I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to the night hum with its quiet forgiveness. Months turned into a year. The pain didn't vanish. It changed shape. It stopped clawing and started sitting quietly beside me, like an old companion I'd learned to live with. I began planting again, not in a shop, but in little pots by the bakery window. Tulips, lavender, daisies, small things that bloomed in silence. People started calling me the woman with the flowers. No one knew my story. No one needed to, because some love stories don't end in saving. They end in remembering, and remembering, I learned, is a kind of keeping. It happened on a gray morning in late March, one of those Everford mornings where the sky can't decide whether to rain or remember how to. I was arranging tulips in the bakery window when the doorbell chimed. The sound startled me, gentle, familiar, almost kind. I looked up and saw Diane standing there. She looked older, thinner, as if time had finally caught up with her, too. "Clara," she said softly. "It's been so long." It had been over a year. I nodded but didn't speak. She looked around the bakery, taking in the quiet charm of it. "It's lovely here." "It's enough," I said. Her eyes darted to the pots by the window. "You're still growing flowers." "Always." There was a pause, the kind that sits heavy between two people who once shared everything but no longer know how to begin again. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I came to tell you something," she said. "Dad passed away last week." I blinked. "Oh." We hadn't spoken in months, not since Evan's funeral. I had stopped expecting news from her, good or bad. "I thought you should know," she added. "He left something for you." She slid the envelope across the counter. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter in my father's uneven handwriting, and a check. I read the words slowly. To Clara. I never said it, but I admired your courage. "I hope this helps you start again. Love, Dad." The check was for $50,000. My breath caught. It was almost cruel. To receive enough to save a life only after the life was gone. I stared at the paper, then at Diane. "He had this money all along?" She nodded faintly. "He didn't know how to help. He thought leaving it to you would make it right." I laughed, a sound too hollow to be joy. "Money doesn't make anything right." "I know," she whispered. For the first time, I saw tears in her eyes, not the polite kind, but real, trembling ones. "I was wrong, Clara, about everything. I should have helped you." I looked at her, at the sister who'd stood in light while I walked through shadow, and felt the anger begin to fade. "We all should have done things differently," I said quietly. Outside, the rain began to fall. Soft, forgiving, endless. Diane took my hand across the counter. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and somehow, against all reason, I believed her. That night, I sat alone by the window, the letter on my lap, and realized that life had a strange way of returning what it had taken. Not as a gift, but as a lesson. The check was paper. The apology was air. But the peace that came after, that was real. A few days after Diane's visit, she invited me to dinner. "Just family," she said. The word family still made my chest tighten, but I went, not out of obligation, but because something in me wanted to close the circle. Her house looked exactly as I remembered. White porch lights, a manicured lawn, the smell of money and lavender. Inside, everything gleamed. The table was set with silverware that caught the light like tiny mirrors, reflecting the version of us we pretended to be. Caleb was there too, sitting stiffly, and beside him my mother, smaller now, fragile, wrapped in a shawl even though the fire was burning. Diane smiled nervously. "I'm glad you came." "So am I," I said. We ate in silence for a while. Small talk, weather, neighbors, work. No one mentioned Evan, as though speaking his name might crack the porcelain calm. Finally, I set my fork down. I got Dad's letter. The air changed. My mother looked at her plate. Caleb cleared his throat. "He wanted you to have it," Diane said quickly. "He felt guilty." "He wasn't the only one," I said quietly. She froze. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When I asked for help, you all had reasons. Prayers, plans, excuses. You talked about faith, about limits. And I believed you. I thought maybe I was asking for too much. My mother's eyes glistened. We didn't know how bad it was. You didn't want to know, I said gently. You didn't want to look at the kind of love that hurts, the kind that costs. No one spoke. The fire cracked softly. Do you know what it's like, I whispered, to watch your child die knowing you did everything and still hear silence from the people who swore they loved you? Diane covered her face with her hands. Caleb looked like he wanted to disappear. We can't change it, Diane said finally, her voice shaking. But we're here now. I know, I said. And maybe that's enough, the room exhaled. The anger that had lived inside me for years finally loosened its grip. I looked around that table, at the family who had failed me, at the same faces that once sang happy birthday to my son, and realized something I hadn't before. Forgiveness isn't about them deserving it. It's about me deserving peace. I stood, pushing my chair back quietly. Thank you for dinner, I said. My mother reached for my hand. Clara, are we forgiven? I smiled, small but real. Not yet, I said, but I'm getting there. Then I walked out into the cool night, the rain beginning again, and felt lighter than I had in years. It was a few weeks after that dinner when I found myself back at the lake. The same lake where my sister's daughter had married, where music once spilled into the night like laughter that didn't belong to me. Now it was quiet. The trees leaned inward, heavy with spring rain, and the water was still except for a few ripples where ducks glided through gray reflections. I sat on the old bench and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from the silence. I was listening to it. There was a strange peace in that stillness. The kind that doesn't come from forgetting, but from accepting. I thought about Evan. His small hands, his crooked smile, the way he used to say, "Mommy, look," as though every flower I grew was a miracle. I realized that in trying to save him, I had given him more than a chance at life. I had shown him what love looks like when it's stripped bare, when it costs everything. Love that doesn't depend on winning. Love that stays even when the world leaves. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken me years to see. Saving him was never just about his heart. It was about mine. His short life had broken me open in all the ways I needed to be broken. The vanity, the pride, the illusion that love can be neat or fair. He had taught me how to love without measure and how to survive without reason. I took a deep breath, tasting the damp air, the faint sweetness of earth after rain. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and for a fleeting second, I thought it was him. Tears welled, but they didn't burn this time. They felt gentle, like a cleansing rain after a long drought. You're still here, I whispered, just not the way I wanted. The wind moved through the trees like a reply, soft, certain, and kind. I looked at the sky, the faint blush of sunset bleeding through the clouds, and smiled. Because for the first time, I realized I hadn't failed him. I had loved him as fiercely as a human being can love another, and that, I thought, must count for something eternal. A year later, spring returned to Everford. The air smelled of wet soil and lilacs again, and for the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel heavy. Just quiet. I still lived above the bakery, still tended to the small pots by the window. The tulips had bloomed early that year, bright, tender, alive. People often stopped to admire them on their morning walks. Some even came inside just to ask what I fed them. Nothing special, I'd say with a smile. Just care. Mrs. Lane once told me she'd never seen flowers grow so beautifully in such small pots. I wanted to tell her that grief can be a kind of fertilizer, that love, when it has nowhere to go, seeps into the soil and makes things bloom brighter. But I just nodded, wiped my hands, and kept arranging. Every Sunday, I still visit the lake. I bring one flower, never a bouquet, just one. I sit on the same bench, let the petals catch the wind, and watch them drift across the water. That's where I talk to him, my Evan. I tell him about the bakery, about the customers, about how the tulips keep surprising me. Sometimes I swear I can feel him listening. The breeze grows warmer, the water ripples just once, and I take it as his hello. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. The ache is still there, but softer, like a scar that no longer stings when touched. Last week, Diane visited the bakery again. She brought her daughter Lillian and a little boy, her grandson. He couldn't have been more than 5. When I bent down to greet him, he smiled, shy and bright. "These flowers smell happy," he said. His words caught me off guard. I laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from myself in years. "Yes," I said, "they do." When they left, Diane hugged me. It wasn't the awkward, distant kind from before. It was real. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. Some forgiveness doesn't need words, just presence. That night, I walked home under the sound of light rain. The streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement like melted stars. I stopped by the window of my shop, looked at the rows of flowers leaning toward the glass, and felt something I hadn't known in so long. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but from understanding. I had given everything I owned to keep my son alive, and though the world didn't give him back, it gave me something else. A heart that knows love's truest measure isn't in saving, but in giving without end. I didn't seek revenge. I found peace, and sometimes that's louder. Have you ever loved someone enough to give everything, even when you knew you might lose them? What does peace mean to you? Acceptance, forgiveness, or remembering? If love could speak, what would it say about what you've held onto and what you've let go? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes, telling our stories is how we keep the people we've loved alive in the world.